Kia ora koutou, welcome to a Whiteboard Friday special edition. Special because it's not Friday, but the reason for this special edition is because this week the government is consulting on the emissions trading scheme. And before we start talking about what the government should do and shouldn't do, we thought we'd do an emissions trading scheme, or ETS, known to its close friends, an emissions trading scheme for dummies. What is the emissions trading scheme? Why do we have it? And what is it trying to achieve? All will be revealed in this special edition. So, first up, you've got to know that we agreed in the 2000s to cap our emissions at 1990 levels. So we said that by 2012, we would cap our emissions at 1990 levels. And the idea was that whatever cap we have on our emissions, the emissions trading scheme can help us achieve that. So over time, that cap is reducing. By 2020, we have to get it down by 5%. By 2030, we have to get it down by 11%. And by 2050, we have to get down to half the emissions that we had in 1990. The trick is that because we haven't done much in the intervening years since 1990, our emissions have actually risen by about 20%. So that means we've got a lot further to go to meet our 2020 and 2030 and ultimately 2050 targets. So where do emissions come from? Well, the biggest source of emissions is actually agriculture, which is 48% of our emissions, almost half. So you can see that if we don't touch agriculture, because we've left it out of the emissions trading scheme, it's very difficult to reduce those agricultural emissions. If we don't reduce those agricultural emissions by 2050, then that means we have to reduce all other emissions to zero. Other sources of emissions currently are energy, which is around about 40%. So that a little bit of that is electricity, so what you use to cool your fridge and heat your house. But that's mostly from renewable sources. Most of that is actually petrol, oil, gas, things like that, those actual fossil fuels that we burn to get around. Transport energy is the biggest source of those emissions. The other area is heat and waste. A lot of that goes into industrial processes. It's what big factories and stuff pump out. For example, Fonterra turning milk into milk powder is a big source of those emissions. That's worth about 12%. So the idea of the emissions trading scheme is that if you want to emit a ton of carbon or other carbon equivalent gases, you have to have a permit to do that. Okay? Now, to drive your car, you probably don't have to buy a permit. That's because the gas station buys it for you. Okay? So if you want to emit a ton of carbon dioxide, you have to get a permit. Now, in 2009, the government changed that so that you could actually emit 2 tons with one permit. That was a little bit of a fudge that they introduced to reduce the impact of the emissions trading scheme. So the question is, okay, I want to go and emit a ton, or nowadays 2 tons of carbon dioxide. Where do I get my permit from? Well, you can buy them from the government, or you can pay a forester for a unit. They will then go away and plant trees which suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and therefore generate a unit which they can sell to you. The downside of this is that, of course, if it's plantation forestry like pine, that is a temporary forest. So eventually it's going to get cut down and those emissions will reappear in the atmosphere. The last place you can go to get an emissions unit is you can go overseas. Other countries have a cap as well, so if someone else is reducing their emissions overseas, technically you can go and buy a unit from them. Of course, that's been the major way that we have met our target by 2012 to reduce emissions to 1990 levels, was buying units from overseas. The downside of that is because of fraudulent reasons, they weren't actually reducing their emissions. So a bit of a problem there, but hopefully that will be fixed in the future. So the idea is that as this cap reduces, government will have less and less units to sell. Other countries will have fewer and fewer units to sell, and so it will get more and more expensive to buy a unit if you want to emit carbon dioxide. So you have a choice. You can either not emit, so for example by buying an electric vehicle, or you can pay more and more for someone to plant trees or reduce emissions elsewhere so that you can continue to drive your car. So that will over time get more and more expensive. So in short, the emissions trading scheme is an important, really important tool for us to achieve the emission reductions that we have to achieve. And if we don't achieve those emissions reductions, we put our international reputation and the entire planet's future at risk. So the ETS can help us achieve those emissions reductions. It's an important tool, but like any tool, you have to know what you're trying to achieve with it. And that is where the problems begin. We'll talk more about that in coming blogs.